So the few positive cases coming in from the Indian camp has left the Indian team worried if their quest to overcome England in the upcoming 5-test series would be affected. That brings us to our first cricket question. If we can have sporting action minus creation of those biosecure bubbles. Now, what are these biosecure bubbles? Essentially, this is asking the players, the participants, to live within restricted environments of a hotel. So they get access only to certain floors of the hotel where they play, roam around, but they do not have access to the public areas where others are involved. And then they are transported to their training base and the stadiums where they play in, and then they come back and again live in that restricted environment. Now, some of the players like to call it a 5-star jail, which is essentially what they end up being, but that is what the virus is forcing us to do. Create those bubbles and play within those bubbles, because once you come out of the bubbles, we're getting these cases cropping in from time to time. Now, to understand this, let's take a look at what has been the journey of this Indian cricket team, to understand how complex this problem is and how difficult does it get to a player, and yet how inevitable it is to create these bubbles. Now, India began playing cricket in the pandemic last year in September with the IPL. So the IPL was of course taken to UAE. A strict biosecure bubble environment was created. Matches were played in Abu Dhabi, Dubai and Sharjah. 8 franchises got together, players from all around the world got together. There were some cases here and there, but largely the tournament was a success, and that biosecure bubble was given a thumbs up by everyone. After that, India traveled to Australia. In Australia, different state governments had different directives given, and so bubble protocols were laid down based on those rules. So at Sydney, for example, the Indian players were allowed to roam around in public areas wearing masks and visit those eateries as well. But yet there were some instances where a fan, for example, posted on social media that he was hugged affectionately by Rishabh Pant. There were some pictures of Indian cricketers with the shopkeepers when they were shopping. These of course became a bit of an issue, but largely it was a considered call taken by Cricket Australia and BCCI that the players should be given this leeway. Eventually that tournament and that tour became a success because those biosecure bubbles were strong enough. Towards the end of the tour, for example in Brisbane, again players had to go back to hard quarantine because the Queensland government enforced those protocols. The players didn't like it, but that's the way that tour was completed. After that, England came to India. Again, all format series which was played in a biosecure environment, and towards the end of that, the COVID situation, it appeared, seemed to be getting better, and so allowances were made for crowds to be allowed. So 50% crowds were allowed at Chennai and Ahmedabad. Now, for those of you who are sort of getting confused as to how crowds can be allowed where the players are living in those bubbles, because the crowds do not get access to the players. So the players are living in a different bubble. They are only confined to the playing area. The crowds are outside, and the players can't even mingle with the commentators who are living in a separate bubble of their own. So that is how cricket was being played. After that came the IPL 2021 in April, and that was a bit of a disaster. That was the most ill-timed tournament because the beginning of that tournament in those 4 clusters, the cities which were assigned those matches coincided with the COVID surge in India. So the second wave began to spread, and things outside that bubble began to be quite grim. And so there were people dying with lack of oxygen, and things were looking quite grim while matches were being played out in the living rooms to empty stands every evening. So it was looking almost inevitable, and there was one case, and then there were a few more, and 4 franchises were affected with the virus, and the BCCI had then to take the decision to suspend the tournament temporarily. After that, India's tour of England, which began with the World Test Championship. Again, a biosecure bubble was created because that was a high-stakes tournament for the ICC. It was a big final, and so the Indian players travelled to England in a chartered flight. They underwent hard quarantine. Southampton was chosen because the AGS Bowl had the facility where they could stay where the ground was, and then this began to train collectively, and then the matches were played with limited crowds, and it was played in a biosecure environment. Then the BCCI had to take a decision, because there's an unusually long break between that World Test Championship final and the Test series that will start on the 4th of August. So what should the players do? Should they be forced to live in a bubble, or they should be given freedom to roam around freely? That's the decision BCCI had to take. At the same time, there were a couple of international teams that were in England, the Pakistan and the Sri Lankan team. The Sri Lankan team, the Sri Lankan board asked its players to follow the biosecure bubble rules very strictly. 3 players were found violating those rules, and they were called back by the Sri Lankan board penalized for not following those rules. After that tournament was over, immediately after that, 7 members of the English cricket team caught the virus. And because the virus was so spread in that English team, they could not continue playing a tournament that was to follow, the series that was to follow against Pakistan. So that team had to be displaced. A new team was put together under the captaincy of Ben Stokes, and they played the series against Pakistan. So again, an example, once you move out of the biosecure environment, and for the English team, for example, some of the players were playing county cricket, and England was opening up. The English government had given the allowance for the players, had made the allowance for the public at large not to wear masks if not necessary. They had become confident that they wanted to lift the restrictions slowly and surely. There were two major sporting tournaments, the Euro and the Wimbledon, where full crowd attendance was allowed. England was in absolute frenzy with the English football team doing well. Everybody was celebrating. And so while outside that was the picture, some players were playing cricket with those restricted environment. Contrasting and stark contrast, as it were, that is the manner in which sport is being played out at this point in time. So the decision, again back to the Indian team, the BCCI decided to give a vacation to the players, taking confidence from the position that the English government had taken. And so that 3-week holidays, players were seen watching Euro, players were seen watching Wimbledon, some went to enjoy themselves at Scotland, some were pictured enjoying waterfalls. Let's not blame the players. The BCCI made a decision to give them permission to enjoy the holidays. They decided to have a good time, frustrated living cricket with restricted environments. Having said that, a lesson again, like I said, once you move out those bubbles, there's always a possibility that the virus will make an entry. So what happens next is something that one needs to look at very, very closely. Because if you thought the English Cricket Board was going to get strict after some of their players were affected, well, that's not what they are thinking. The English Cricket Board CEO, Tom Harrison, is sort of singing a completely different tune, and I'll quote him. Players are just fed up with biosecurity and bubbles and that language we've become so used to using. It's had such a detrimental impact on mental health for players, time away from families. We are just not able to operate that kind of environment going forward. So what the ECB is doing is they are not going to create these proper restricted environments for the India-England Test series that's coming up. There are some other important major tournaments for the ECB coming up with the 100 as well. But how is that going to be the way forward in future as well? There are some big stakes tournament coming up. The IPL, for example, the T20 World Cup, for example, both of which will be played in the UAE. The stakes there are so high, with 8 franchisees and 16 international teams participating, players from all around the world, that perhaps one lapse in the tournament could be endangered, and perhaps the administrators would not want to take that risk. So going forward, player welfare, player mental health, or biosecure bubbles. Ideally, one would want to lean towards player welfare, but let's face it, from time to time, the administrators will have to continue to think if not creating bio bubbles in playing sport is at this point in time a risk worth taking. A second cricket question is around this whole debate of second string teams doing well in cricket. This in many ways has been a season of underdogs. Our good friend Sri Lankan World Cup winning captain Arjuna Ranatunga, however, isn't very happy. He called out the Sri Lankan Cricket Board for allowing India to send a second string team to Sri Lanka. Well, to start with, the English cricket team looked at the depth of its own cricket, put together a team on the park with some of their players out of action due to COVID, led by Ben Stokes, and they went on to beat Pakistan convincingly. Let's not be surprised if India defeats Sri Lanka convincingly, because unlike what Ranatunga said, this is anything but a second string team. If you look at the makeup of the Indian side, it is really an all-star IPL Indian outfit with so many dynamic players. And let's face it, Ranatunga, for example, is someone who stopped wearing that thinking cap that he used to as a player. I don't know how much cricket he watches anymore. It's perhaps a remark that was aimed for reasons other than cricket at some of his not so good friends in Sri Lankan Cricket Board who he does not like too much. Well, that's Ranatunga for you. That's it for today. Do keep watching 2 Cricket Questions and send in your comments regularly.